expectations and rules for living. Maybe they're written, maybe they're unwritten rules. Every family has a box, with expectations and roles and boundaries for their children. In our family, there's no screen time until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now that's kind of something we made up. It's not in the Bible, but it's in our box. It makes up the walls of our box. And there's all kinds of different boxes that we have. And we usually create boxes to help provide boundaries, to protect ourselves and to protect our children, people that we love. And then as our children age and mature, we begin to maybe either expand the box or at times, at some point, right, they become adults and we let them go and hope that they have good boundaries in their own lives for behavior. Recently, we were eating at Perkins. This is actually like 2 months ago. And if you've ever been to the Lamar truck stop, you know that the Perkins there has those quarter games, like with the claw that comes down and you try to grab things. Me, being the cheapskate that I am, I scoff at those who play those games. Like, you're never going to win that, right? But on this occasion, my daughter Piper wanted very much to play the claw game. Now, ordinarily, my box would have said, no, Piper, that's a waste of your money, right? But this time we decided, Piper, you have your own money. I don't know, she got it for her birthday, something. I said, Piper, if you want to spend your own money on that, you're more than welcome to do so. I said, but I want you to know that these games are designed to make you lose. And there's a good chance we're going to go home penniless and trinketless, But Piper was convinced that she was going to be naturally gifted at the claw game. And so we had dinner, and then on the way out, we played the claw game. And we had a tearful ride home, penniless and toyless. But that's just part of growing up, right? We kind of expand the boxes. We let our kids make decisions. Some of us grew up with boxes, silly boxes, like what sports teams you were or were not supposed to root for. In our home, the boxes, the parameters were that you rooted for the Yankees. You could be all right with other sports teams, like they could be casual acquaintances and friends, but you most certainly did not root for the Red Sox. And there was no rhyme necessarily or reason to that, but it was just part of life when it came to football. You could root for the Bills, or you could root for the Steelers, and really any team for that matter, but not the Cowboys. And we couldn't put together two logical reasons why we shouldn't root for the Cowboys, or for the Red Sox for that matter, but they were just these unwritten boundaries that we pass off from generation to generation, these kind of structures for living. There's unhealthy boxes. One of the reasons that racism is so difficult to overcome is because we have boxes in our lives that we don't even know that we have. Like they're hidden, and yet they influence us in a lot of ways. I was reading a study recently. The study was actually 17 years old. But the researchers wanted to know, what does the effect of your name have on your job opportunities? So they applied to 5,000 jobs, and they made up resumes. They were pretty much the same resume, but for some of the resumes, they gave them a very African-American sounding name, and for others, they had very white sounding names. So Connor would apply for a job, and Deshaun would apply for a job. And what the researchers found was that Deshaun had to apply for 15 jobs before he got one call back, whereas Connor had to apply for 10 jobs before he got a call back. Now, we would often say, like, we, have gotten over the hurdle, hopefully, on racism. And yet, when research comes back like that, we recognize that there's still places in our society and in our lives that are still deeply disordered, right? So we have disordered boxes in our lives as well, right? There are faith boxes, all right? Ways in which we organize our faith and the way that we see the world and understand God and the Bible, the way that we view church and the way that we kind of structure our lives around God's Word. Sometimes our faith boxes include things that are kind of peripheral, like do we sprinkle baptism or do we dunk baptism? Or do we raise our hands in worship or do we put our hands down in worship? And these are not really central to necessarily like crucial doctrine, right? And yet there's other times, when our boxes also begin to flow into things like what a Christian should or shouldn't do, or sometimes we say God can or cannot act in a certain way. And when we are at our best, when we are healthy Christians, I'll put the box there. We love Jesus, and we organize our life around bringing him joy and obeying him. We understand that Jesus' commands are helpful to us because a life without boundaries is a dangerous life, right? When a life of faith becomes all about the box, though, the boundaries, a couple of things can happen. Either we decide, I want to know where the boundary is so that I can get absolutely as close to that boundary without sinning. Or we become really good at boxes, and we kind of have a shame on them mentality for their box, right? And the way that they organize and structure others may structure their lives. And rather than having a relationship with Jesus that invites people in, oftentimes we almost begin to worship our boxes rather than Jesus, and it creates barriers to the gospel. There's a whole theory out there on this called bounded set versus centered set. And some of the authors who wrote about this use this analogy. I think this is very helpful. And this is going to become a framework for understanding the story of Jesus today in the call of Matthew. But anyway, they give this analogy. Imagine if there's a rancher who has 3 acres, all right? Not a very big ranch. I don't even know if you count that as a ranch in rancher terms. And he wants to keep his cows in, and so it's very reasonable for him to build a fence all the way around his ranch. And that keeps his cattle in, and it keeps the other cattle out, right? But let's say there's another rancher who has an enormous ranch. So huge that it's really unreasonable for him to fence in the entire thing. What would be a better analogy, and I'm not a rancher, so I don't know if this is a real thing or not, but it makes for a good sermon illustration, so I'm going to run with it, is that it would make more sense for a rancher in that case to dig wells on his ranch. The idea being that the wells are what are going to keep the cattle alive, and being smart cattle that they are, they're not going to wander too far from the water source. And so that understanding the way that we structure our faith that way is healthier. We understand that Jesus is living water. And when we can experience Jesus, our whole perspective of our box changes. And it goes from, how close can I get to the edge without sinning, to, I don't want to go anywhere that takes me one step away from the source of living water. All right? A few weeks ago, Chad spoke on the Samaritan woman. And the idea is very much on display there, that here's a woman who has pushed the boundaries of her life. She's been married 7 times. She's lived an immoral life. And yet Jesus doesn't really go after that so much as he says to her, I am living water. If you drink from me, you will never be thirsty again. He recognizes that the heart must change before there's any kind of change in behavior as well. So certainly boundaries are helpful. But fences are not always so helpful. This is why Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Not keep my commandments and then you'll learn to love me. The love is what motivates the commandment keeping, right? Obedience without love is legalism, and love without obedience would be rebellion. So, what we're going for today is we want to talk about our motivation in obedience and the focus of our expectations on others. Do we let boxes become barriers? Does the box sometimes in our lives become the main thing rather than Jesus being the main thing? And at different points in church history, this looks differently. I was talking to a pastor the other day who said that he has tattoos, and he went to speak at another church, and they told him, if you're going to preach here, you got to make sure you wear long sleeves so nobody sees us. And I thought, man, I really thought we were beyond that at this point. But that would be a perfect example of a bounded set kind of a rule. Like, there are these boundaries, we don't cross them. In this kind of a scenario, image is everything. Appearance is important. The list of things to avoid becomes more important than Jesus. And what happens when we worship the box is that when we fail, we, like the story of the prodigal son, we just feel exhausted at trying to keep the rules. We've lost sight of the Father, and we just run off to the distant country. Or when rules become everything, we become very good at keeping them. We become like the older brother in the story, and our lives are still not anywhere closer to the Father's heart, but we are judgmental and legalistic. When that view extends to God, we have a really distorted view of him in which he's always ready to catch us at every sin and every turn, rather than seeing God as a father with his arms open wide. And I've come to realize that if we want to see spiritual breakthrough, we have to disrupt our boxes. Jesus is a box breaker, all right? We can't keep Jesus in a box and dictate how he might work in our lives or in the lives of others that we love. And we need to see Jesus as someone who pushes against the boundaries in order to bring lost people to him. So today we're going to turn to Matthew 9. And in Matthew 9, verses 1 to 8, real quickly, I'll read these for us because this sets the stage for what's to come. And these verses will be on the screen behind you. Matthew 9, 1 to 8 says this: "And getting into a boat, Jesus crossed over and came to his own city. And behold, some people brought to him a paralytic lying on a bed. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, 'Take heart, my son, your sins are forgiven.' And behold, some of the scribes said to themselves, 'This man is blaspheming.' But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, 'Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Rise and walk"? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." Then he said to the paralytic, "Rise, take up your bed and go home." And he rose and went home. And when the crowd saw it, they were afraid, and they glorified God who had given such authority to men. Now, all throughout the Gospels, Jesus is constantly disrupting the boxes of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and the religious experts. They had a very confined view of how God could work and would work and how people ought to behave. If there was any ambiguity about a law of Moses, they would create a box smaller than what the law of Moses even said. They were wonderful box builders, all right? And they had a box in which a prophet, like Jesus, they considered him to possibly be a prophet, a teacher of the law. They weren't sure what to make of Jesus at this point, but they had to reconcile somehow that he was healing people. They had seen him heal other people, and so it was not outside of the realm of possibility that a prophet would heal. We had seen it in the Old Testament. Prophets had healed many people. But it most certainly broke their box to see that a prophet could forgive sins, because that role belonged only to God. Only God could forgive sins. And that was accurate. And what Jesus was saying in this passage, as he forgives the paralytic, interesting that he forgives the man before he raises him, heals his broken body, is he wants to kind of push against this idea and to demonstrate his authority as God. Jesus is more than a prophet, and he has authority to forgive sins. And this destroys their box. They cannot reconcile it. Even the people who watched him, the crowds, the ordinary blue-collar workers, they have this weird mixture of emotion. In verse 8, it says, when the crowd saw it, they were afraid. Sometimes when Jesus moves in a powerful way, it scares us a little bit. They were afraid, and they glorified God. So there was this mixing together of fear and excitement at what God was doing by being a sin forgiver. So Jesus disrupts the scribes in that passage. And I think what this does then is sets the stage really well for verse 9. So Jesus is never kind of like, well, I'll stretch you in this area, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back and we'll revisit this later on. Instead, he's constantly always pushing against boundaries. And what we read in verse 9 is this. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. So Jesus, in this passage, disrupts another box. He disrupts Matthew's box, for that matter, as well as continues to mess with the minds of the Pharisees and scribes. So far in the gospel story, Jesus has called fishermen to be his disciples. Now, fishermen are certainly not necessarily the kind of people that rabbis would ordinarily ask to be in their close group, but they were good people, right? Salt of the earth kind of guys. And so Jesus inviting fishermen to be his disciples pushed against the boundaries of some of the culture, But it wasn't that earth-shattering. In fact, when we get to Acts chapter 4, it says, we read that the people are astounded at Peter's teaching because he taught them, because they took note that these men, they were unschooled, ordinary men, but they had spent time with Jesus. But why this story is just so radical is that Matthew completely breaks the mold on the kind of person that any rabbi would ever ask to be his disciple. Let's just talk about tax collectors for a bit. There's occupations that we like to pick on, right? Maybe we've all heard lawyer jokes, or we like to pick on politicians and talk about how corrupt they are. But we can still hope, right? We can still hope for good lawyers. We can still hope for good politicians. The fact that you are a lawyer or you are a politician doesn't necessitate that you are corrupt, right? In fact, we may have sons or daughters that someday we hope will grow to become godly and good politicians and lawyers, people who stand for justice. This was not the case with tax collectors. No Jewish boy ever grew up dreaming about becoming a tax collector. And certainly no Jewish mom or dad sat down with little Joseph and said, "Joseph, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And he says, "A tax collector." And like, "That's a terrible idea, son." And the reason for this, the reason why being a tax collector was so bad, is there was a couple clear reasons. Number one, let's remember that Israel is under Roman rule now. So they have an invading force, and Rome is in their land. They are occupying Jerusalem. They are living and ruling over the Israelite people. And the Israelites deeply resented that. Imagine if another nation invaded America, defeated our armed forces, and then set up rule over us. There would be animosity towards those people, right? We would want them to be overthrown. We'd want to get our freedom back, right? And that's very much how the Israelites felt. And so not only was that opposing force ruling over them, but the Romans were taxing them. They had to get their money. And the way that the Romans taxed was they had tax contracts for sale. And they would sell these contracts to the highest bidder. And if you owned a contract, then you had the legal authority to collect taxes from your countrymen. The problem was that nobody really knew how much the tax contract was worth except the tax collector. And the way in which a tax collector made his living was to collect more than was due. All right, so the tax contract was for $100,000, and you're the only one who knows what the contract is worth. And so you then go out and you collect $150,000 from your relatives and your friends, your neighbors, the people of your community, and you become very wealthy in doing so. And so tax collectors, by their very nature, extorted people. It's not that tax collecting was a sin. In fact, John the Baptist was preaching one day, and tax collectors came to him, and they said, "What should we do if we want to repent?" And he said to them, "Don't collect any more than you're supposed to," which, from what I understand, Roman tax law, they would have been jobless because they would not have been able to even support themselves. And so nobody liked tax collectors because they were notoriously good at oppressing people. And secondly, they were collaborators. It's one thing if a Roman government wants to take your money, you might give it to them begrudgingly. But it's another thing if the friend that you grew up with down the block decides to work for them someday, become wealthy, working for the government that you despise. And so now they're seen as traitors to the Jewish nation. And it was so bad at this time in history that the religious leaders had created an exception to the ninth commandment, which is don't lie. And they would say to the Israelites, don't lie except to tax collectors. Like, you get a free pass when it comes to tax collectors. Whatever it takes to not pay your taxes and not deal with them is good with me and good with God, they would say. And so this is who Matthew is. Matthew, from what commentators believe, is that he worked in Capernaum along the sea, and he was like an import-export tax collector. As boats crossed into the territory, he would then collect for the government there. And so this is a horrible person to pick. If you're trying to kind of help your PR as a rabbi, because you keep doing things that confuse people, like forgive sins, asking Matthew to be on your squad is not a good plan, right? It's just going to further push the boundaries. And yet that's what Jesus does. He says to Matthew 2 words, "Follow me." And Matthew rose and followed him. Jesus, and it's fascinating here, Jesus doesn't sit down and rip Matthew up one side and down the other and tell him what an evil man he is and how dare he collect all this money and betray his countrymen. He doesn't need to tell him to stop extorting people and to stop stealing their money, to not live a life ruled by greed. It was implicit in the command to follow me that Matthew would naturally have to walk away from those things. But Jesus doesn't start with the behaviors, he starts with a command to be his disciple. He's saying to Matthew, "Matthew, I choose you. I don't care what these other cats think, right? I want you to be one of my disciples." And the reality was this was going to cost Matthew quite a bit. It's going to cost you your career, possibly your friends. And I imagine that Matthew in this moment was faced with all kinds of emotions. What does this mean for me? How am I going to provide for my family? How am I going to provide for myself? Because I'm going to lose my job. It's not like Rome is going to give me a 3-year vacation while I follow Rabbi Jesus around, hold my job for me. No, they want their taxes. And to follow Jesus means you're going to lose your job for Matthew. Interestingly, the fishermen didn't have to quite make that decision. You remember that after Jesus dies and resurrects, and Peter, James, and John go back to fishing, right? But we don't read about Matthew going back to tax collecting again. To follow Jesus, for him, meant he would lose many things. Imagine, though, if Jesus had said, "Matthew, when you get your life cleaned up, then you can be my follower." That's not how it works. Instead, Jesus says, "Matthew, be my follower, and I will clean up your life." Jesus doesn't point Matthew to the fences. Jesus points Matthew to the well of living water and says, "Come to me, Matthew." And in the coming, Matthew runs far from his former life. Matthew's life is forever changed. You might think of him as a second career kind of follower of Jesus, right? And it's interesting. Some commentators say the things that made Matthew a good tax collector, he obviously knew how to write. He had to keep ledgers and a journal to know who paid their taxes and who didn't. Possibly made him a good disciple. And the fact is that we read his story in the book that he wrote, right? We read the story of Matthew in the book of Matthew. I also appreciate that Matthew's really honest with his story. He tells it as it is, which moves into Jesus making one further disruption. He pushes the boxes even more. And we read about it in the last 3 or 4 verses. It says, so Matthew has followed him. Verse 10 says, "And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?' But when he heard it, he said, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners.'" You can almost hear the exasperation in the voices of the leaders, right? It's fascinating to me that they keep following him, the Pharisees. They follow him when he heals and forgives the lame man. They follow him apparently along the shore, I imagine, as he calls Matthew to be his disciple. And now as Matthew holds a party in Jesus' honor and invites all of his scoundrel friends along to this party, the Pharisees are there too. They can't. There's something compelling about Jesus that makes them want to watch. Maybe it's like an accident, right? Something, there's a fire, and you're just compelled to drive by it, right? What's going to happen? What's going to happen next? Maybe that's what it's like with Jesus. And again, their box is pushed even further. Messy people, by the way, have messy friends. And Matthew wants them to meet Jesus too. And Jesus is more than happy to oblige. I love the fact that Matthew, the first thing we find recorded that he does as a disciple is invite all of his friends to come meet Jesus. And these are, if you're a tax collector, your friend circle is going to be pretty small. And it's going to be made up of people who are like you, right? You're not going to be hanging out with the religious elite if you're a tax collector. You're going to be hanging out with the rough crowd. And these are the people that he brings to meet Jesus. And by the way, this is how revivals start. New Christians have lots of friends who are not Christians, and they're so in love with Jesus, they've tasted the well, they've gotten a drink, and all they can do is think about how they can bring other people to drink from that same well. And the reality is, the longer we become Christians, the more we kind of curate our friend circle to look like us. And we're not so inclined to have friends like Matthew. But new believers have lots of lost friends. In fact, I would say that if your life hasn't been disrupted by the uncomfortable tension of figuring out how to follow Jesus and love the lost, then you might want to reevaluate who you spend time with. It is much, much easier to create boxes, our bounded set, and to say that Jesus can work within these contexts. He can do things like the way we understand them, but he can't work outside of that. Right? This passage has taught us that Jesus is a box breaker. Oh, he can heal. We can get on board with his healing, but he certainly can't forgive sin. Okay, I guess he can forgive sin, but certainly he won't ask Matthew to be his disciple. Oh man, he asked Matthew to be his disciple. Well, maybe he did that because he knew Matthew would reform his behavior. Oh, now he's going to a party at Matthew's house with all these other, worldly and sinful types. Jesus consistently pushes against the norms of his day. And what I love, and I think the heartbeat of this passage is found in verse 12. Verse 13, when he says to the Pharisees, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And this is a hard lesson for the Pharisees because they understood sacrifice. To their credit, the Pharisees were very good rule followers. They understood sacrifice. Jesus in Matthew 23 kind of goes on this rampage against the Pharisees. And he says, you guys are so careful to tithe every little herb in your garden, right? I'm going to pick my corn, or I'm going to pick my I don't know, what's a good herb? Basil, what'd you say? Basil. There we go, basil. You're picking your basil, and you're like, all right, I got 10 basil leaves. I'm going to send one to the missionaries. And he says, you're really good at that, and yet your hearts are completely corrupt. You've lost the reason behind it. It's entirely possible to do the right things and not love Jesus. Mercy leads to sacrifice, but the sacrifice is so much more beautiful in the shadow of God's mercy. The people that God asks us to love and to show mercy to will not always behave the way we want them to, or that makes us comfortable. And if we demand behavior reform before heart transformation, we will lose them. Instead, though, if we see Jesus as a deep, refreshing well of water, we will not only want to drink from that well ourselves, but we will be delighted to invite other people to drink from it as well. We won't be so concerned about wondering, where is the line exactly? How close can I get to the boundary without crossing it? Instead, we'll be more aggrieved when we see anyone take a step away from Jesus, whether they've crossed the boundary or not. And we will be delighted when we see anyone take a step closer to the well of living water. Even if at that point, in that step, they haven't even met Jesus yet. But they're searching and they're curious and they're coming closer to Jesus. So, just a few closing questions for us. I want us to ask ourselves a couple of things. Quite honestly, has someone's lifestyle or behavior kept you from showing mercy to them or loving them the way that Jesus does? Is there any place in your life that you may have made an idol out of obedience? That sounds so weird. I understand that because obedience is important. We want to follow the commands of Christ. But sometimes we can worship our obedience and exalt that over worshiping and loving Jesus, the one who gives us the strength to be obedient. Who is your Matthew? And do our lives make people thirsty for Jesus? The church rarely sees revival happen when we become staunch or when all we talk about is our fences. We see revival happen when we bring Jesus to the well, bring people to the well of living water in Jesus. And that's my heart for the commonplace, that we would be a people inviting others to drink deeply from Jesus Christ. So worship team, if you want to come on up, I'll lead us in prayer. So So Heavenly Father, I pray that if there are any boxes that we have in our lives that are not of you, that you would give us the grace to see that. I pray that we would be people of mercy. And I pray that we would, Lord, I just want the common place to be a place where the people are deeply, all of us, are deeply in love and passionately in love with Jesus Christ. And that love is like a well that others, people who are far from you, will just long to come close to Jesus. So I pray that would be a trademark of our church, and we can't imagine the impact that we could have if that was the case. In Jesus' name.